People didn't stay silent because they were blind. They stayed silent because they were afraid. Jim Jones did not begin as a monster. He began as a preacher who spoke about equality, racial justice, and care for the poor. In the 1950s and 1960s, when segregation still shaped much of American life, Jones' message felt radical, even righteous. He preached integration. He opened his church to the marginalized. He promised a community where everyone mattered, and many believed him. The People's Temple was founded in Indiana, later expanding into California. It was officially a church, recognized, protected, and granted legitimacy through religious status. That label mattered. It granted tax exemptions, credibility, and a shield against scrutiny. Behind the sermons, control was already forming. Jones demanded loyalty. He framed himself as a prophet, sometimes even a divine figure. Members were encouraged to confess personal secrets publicly, creating leverage. Criticism was labeled betrayal. Dissent was treated as spiritual weakness. The setting was fertile for manipulation. Many followers were poor, elderly, disabled, or seeking belonging. Jones provided food, housing, and a sense of purpose. In return, he demanded obedience, absolute obedience. Abuse followed power. Within the temple, physical punishment was normalized. Members were beaten, humiliated, and isolated. Children were disciplined harshly. Jones orchestrated fake healings to reinforce belief in his supernatural authority. Sexual abuse was rampant. If you follow real stories where faith and power collide, this channel is for you. Jones coerced sexual relationships with both adults and minors, framing them as acts of loyalty or spiritual necessity. He claimed control over members' bodies. Couples were separated. Children were raised communally, weakening family bonds and strengthening dependence on him. The crimes were known. Former members defected and warned authorities. Families begged for investigations. Journalists raised red flags. Allegations included beatings, sexual abuse, financial exploitation, and psychological torture. But the response was slow. People's Temple's status as a church complicated oversight. Jones cultivated relationships with politicians, activists, and media figures. He presented himself as a humanitarian leader. Complaints were dismissed as exaggerations or attacks on religious freedom. As scrutiny increased, Jones escalated control. In the mid-1970s, he announced a radical solution: relocation. He framed it as an escape from persecution, racism, and capitalist corruption. The destination was Guyana, a remote jungle settlement he called Jonestown. Isolation was the point. Hundreds of followers moved with him. Once there, passports were confiscated. Communication with the outside world was restricted. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Jones broadcast sermons over loudspeakers day and night, reinforcing paranoia and obedience. Life in Jonestown was harsh. Food was scarce. Labor was relentless. Punishment for dissent was severe. Children were separated from parents. Public confessions continued. Jones staged white nights rehearsals for mass suicide, presented as acts of revolutionary loyalty. Some members wanted to leave. They were threatened, beaten, or detained. Jones framed escape as betrayal that would endanger everyone. Fear replaced faith. The outside world finally intervened in 1978. U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan traveled to Jonestown with journalists and concerned relatives. Initially, Jones staged a welcoming display, but cracks appeared quickly. Members passed notes begging for rescue. As Ryan prepared to leave with defectors, Jones made his decision. At a nearby airstrip, Temple gunmen ambushed the group. Congressman Ryan and 4 others were murdered. Back in Jonestown, Jones initiated the final act. He gathered the community and ordered mass suicide. Cyanide-laced poison was distributed first to children, then adults. Armed guards ensured compliance. Over 900 people died, including more than 300 children. Jones himself died from a gunshot wound. The aftermath stunned the world. Jonestown became synonymous with cult violence. But beneath the shock was a deeper truth. This tragedy did not emerge overnight. It was the result of years of unchecked abuse, enabled by religious protection, political connections, and fear of confronting a powerful institution labeled a church. Investigations followed. Survivors testified about systematic abuse. Reports documented repeated warnings ignored by authorities. The religious shield that once protected People's Temple was stripped away, but only after irreversible loss. The reflection is devastating. Jim Jones was not invisible. He was visible, celebrated, and defended. His crimes were buried beneath ideology, charisma, and the legal protections afforded to religious organizations. Faith was weaponized, trust was exploited, and accountability arrived only after bodies were counted. Jonestown reminds us that when institutions are protected from scrutiny simply because they call themselves holy, abuse does not just persist, it escalates, and sometimes the cost is not dozens of lives, it is hundreds. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Eddie Long was once considered one of the most influential spiritual figures in the United States. As the leader of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in Lithonia, Georgia, he rose from obscurity to international prominence, becoming the face of a new era of charismatic black evangelical leadership. He commanded a massive congregation, built a sprawling religious campus, mentored celebrities and politicians, and became a central figure in Atlanta's faith community. But beneath the polished sermons, the televised services, and the powerful persona, a series of dark accusations would eventually unravel his ministry and destroy his reputation. Eddie Long was born in 1953 in Huntersville, North Carolina, and moved to Atlanta in the early 1980s, when he took over New Birth Missionary Baptist Church. It had roughly 300 members. Under his leadership, the church expanded at a rapid pace, growing to over 25,000 congregants, making it one of the largest megachurches in the United States. Long's style was bold, theatrical, and deeply emotional. He had a talent for weaving personal stories into biblical messages, making followers feel both inspired and spiritually guided. His sermons spoke about discipline, prosperity, and righteousness, an intoxicating blend for those seeking meaning and direction. New Birth became known for its massive events, energetic worship services, community programs, and political influence. Eddie Long openly supported public figures, participated in national religious discussions, and attracted celebrities, athletes, and civil rights leaders to his pews. He promoted a message of kingdom living, a belief that God rewards faith with success and abundance. Followers donated generously, and Long's visibility grew with every televised broadcast and public appearance. By the early 2000s, he was not just a pastor but a cultural figure, one whose words were trusted by millions. But the empire he built began to crack in 2010, when 4 young men, all former members of the congregation and participants in Long's youth leadership programs, filed lawsuits accusing him of sexual misconduct. The allegations sent shockwaves through the religious world. These young men claimed that Long had used his position as a spiritual father, mentor, and authority figure to manipulate them into sexual relationships when they were teenagers or barely adults. They detailed how Long provided them with gifts, trips, private lodging, and emotional grooming under the guise of mentorship. The accusations outlined a disturbing pattern. The young men described private meetings, late-night communication, and moments where Long allegedly blurred the lines between spiritual guidance and inappropriate intimacy. They claimed he used biblical rhetoric to justify his actions, telling them that their relationship was divinely approved. The lawsuits painted a picture of a leader who exploited trust, manipulated authority, and preyed on vulnerability, behavior vastly contradictory to the image he had cultivated for decades. Eddie Long denied the accusations vehemently, standing before his congregation in one of the most widely broadcasted sermons of his career. He held a Bible in his hand and declared he would fight like David against Goliath. His church responded with overwhelming support. Members stood, applauded, and reaffirmed their love for him. For many, the idea that their beloved pastor could be involved in such acts was unthinkable. Long relied heavily on emotional language and symbolic gestures, presenting himself as a man under attack rather than one confronting serious allegations. However, behind the scenes, the pressure mounted. The lawsuits gained national attention, with news outlets diving deeper into Long's private life, finances, and past behavior. Journalists began uncovering patterns of questionable conduct, financial decisions, and inconsistencies within the church's operations. The image of Long as a moral authority began to erode, replaced by public scrutiny and speculation. In May 2011, the lawsuit was settled out of court. Neither party admitted wrongdoing, but the settlement amount, estimated to be in the millions, raised further questions. Long never directly addressed the details again, choosing silence over explanation. While legally the matter was closed, public perception shifted permanently. Many believers who once viewed him as a symbol of strength and moral leadership saw the settlement as an implicit acknowledgement of guilt. The impact on New Birth Missionary Baptist Church was immediate and severe. Attendance dropped dramatically, and financial contributions declined. The church that once thrived with tens of thousands now struggled to maintain its operations. Staff members left, programs were scaled back, and the reputation of the ministry suffered a blow from which it would never fully recover. Those who had followed Long for decades felt a profound sense of betrayal. Some described the experience as losing faith in religion itself. Others were devastated that the man they saw as a father figure could be capable of such harm. Throughout the 2010s, Long's health began to deteriorate. He appeared noticeably thinner during sermons, leading to speculation about his condition. In 2016, he publicly announced he was battling an undisclosed illness. His once powerful voice weakened, his presence diminished, and his influence faded. On January 15, 2017, Eddie Long passed away at the age of 63. For some, his death brought closure. For others, it deepened unresolved questions. His legacy remains one of the most complicated in modern American ministry, a story of extraordinary rise, devastating scandal, and a fall that reshaped the perception of megachurch power dynamics. Eddie Long's case symbolizes the dangers of unchecked pastoral authority. His charisma, influence, and control over congregants created an environment where behavior could go unquestioned and boundaries could be crossed without accountability. The young men who came forward demonstrated immense courage, standing up to one of the most powerful pastors in the country. Their actions not only exposed hidden abuses but also forced a national conversation about how spiritual leaders can exploit trust and manipulate devotion. Today, scholars, religious leaders, and psychologists study Long's downfall as a case study in spiritual abuse, power manipulation, and the consequences of celebrity-driven faith. It serves as a warning to congregations everywhere. Faith must never shield wrongdoing, and leaders, no matter how revered, must be held accountable. The collapse of Long's ministry reveals the profound damage caused when authority is abused behind the protective veil of religion. Eddie Long preached sermons about righteousness, obedience, and moral purity, but in the end, the actions that came to light contradicted everything he claimed to stand for. His story, from powerful preacher to fallen leader, underscores the tragic truth that even those who speak of heaven can lead lives hidden in shadows. His legacy will forever be marked, not by his sermons or his megachurch, but by the courage of those who exposed the truth. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Tony Alamo, born Bernie Lazar Hoffman in 1934, rose to prominence in the 1960s and 1970s as a charismatic and flamboyant preacher who claimed he was chosen by God to lead a new spiritual awakening. Alongside his wife Susan, he founded the Tony and Susan Alamo Christian Foundation, a movement that presented itself as a haven for the lost, the broken, and those seeking a deeper connection with God. But behind the facade of faith, music, and televised sermons lay darkness, decades of abuse, exploitation, manipulation, and crimes that ultimately led to his downfall and imprisonment. Tony Alamo did not begin life in the church. He grew up in a troubled environment, got involved in petty crime, worked in the music industry, and reinvented himself multiple times. By the mid-1960s, he discovered the power of evangelical preaching and the vulnerability of people searching for hope. His charisma allowed him to gather followers quickly. His booming voice, dramatic sermons, and promises of spiritual revival brought in lost souls from across Los Angeles. His wife Susan, a talented speaker and organizer, helped transform his street preaching into an organized ministry that blended fiery sermons with emotional manipulation. By the early 1970s, the Alamos had developed a dedicated following. The ministry's compounds were filled with people who had given up everything, homes, jobs, families, to commit themselves to Tony and Susan's spiritual leadership. Followers worked without pay, believing their labor was an offering to God. They printed literature, built facilities, sewed sequined jackets for celebrities, and operated businesses that generated enormous revenue for Tony. Meanwhile, Alamo lived like royalty, wearing expensive clothing, driving flashy cars, and surrounding himself with wealth, while publicly preaching humility. After Susan's death in 1982, something shifted in Tony Alamo's psyche. Without his wife's influence, Tony became even more controlling. He declared Susan's body would not decay and claimed she would be resurrected. Long after her burial, he continued preaching that she would return, an emotional tactic that deepened followers' dependence on him. Anyone who doubted him faced punishment, humiliation, or expulsion from the group. Reports from former members paint a disturbing picture. Tony Alamo ruled through fear, sleep deprivation, violence, and threats of eternal damnation. Children were beaten, adults were isolated from family members, and members who tried to leave were harassed, stalked, or publicly shamed. Alamo imposed strict rules, monitoring clothing, behavior, friendships, and even thoughts. Followers believed that questioning Tony was equivalent to questioning God. But the darkest crimes were not yet known to the outside world. Whispers of sexual misconduct, forced marriages, and abuse began to emerge. Multiple former members reported that Tony Alamo took young girls as wives, sometimes as young as 8 or 9. He justified these actions with scripture twisted to fit his desires, claiming he had divine approval. Former members later testified that girls were threatened, isolated, and manipulated into compliance. Law enforcement grew suspicious as more victims came forward. Families who escaped the compound described horrifying conditions: children forced to work long hours, denied schooling, and beaten for minor infractions. Adults were pressured to surrender their possessions, sign over property, and obey without question. The FBI, local law enforcement, and child protective agencies began looking closely at the Arkansas-based compound. In 1994, Alamo was convicted of tax evasion and spent several years in prison. But the ministry continued operating in his absence. After his release, he resumed leadership, becoming even more paranoid and aggressive. He forced followers to move frequently, avoided authorities, and continued exploiting members financially and emotionally. But the accusations of sexual crimes grew stronger. Victims, some now adults, were finally ready to speak publicly. One of the turning points came when multiple young women filed civil suits, claiming Tony Alamo had taken them as underage brides. Their testimonies described abuse, coercion, and fear stories that echoed each other with chilling consistency. Federal investigators launched a full criminal investigation, interviewing former members, collecting evidence, and building a case against the pastor who claimed to speak for God but acted like a tyrant. In 2009, Tony Alamo was convicted on 10 counts of transporting minors across state lines for sexual purposes. Prosecutors described him as a predator who used religion to justify the exploitation of children. The courtroom heard emotional testimonies from victims who bravely recounted years of systematic abuse. They described being separated from their parents, threatened with damnation, and forced into relationships that left lifelong scars. The verdict was decisive. Tony Alamo was sentenced to 175 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence. The judge stated that Alamo showed no remorse and that his actions were among the most severe abuses of authority imaginable. The sentence sent a message to religious groups nationwide: spiritual leaders are not above the law, and using faith as a shield for exploitation carries devastating consequences. The aftermath for Alamo's followers was painful and complicated. Many had known no other life. Some had been born into the ministry and could not distinguish Alamo's doctrine from reality. Former members struggled with trauma, guilt, fear, and the daunting challenge of reintegration into society. Others continued to believe in Alamo, even after his conviction, claiming he was persecuted for his faith, a testament to the deep psychological control he held over his flock. Property belonging to the Alamo ministry was seized and sold to compensate victims. Buildings that once symbolized spiritual devotion became reminders of deception and abuse. Survivors used settlement funds to rebuild their lives, seek therapy, and reconnect with family members from whom they'd been separated. Tony Alamo died in federal prison in 2017, leaving behind a legacy not of spiritual leadership, but of manipulation, violence, and exploitation. His name, once associated with revival and religious enterprise, is now a symbol of the dark extremes of cult-like control. His story stands as a brutal reminder of how charismatic leaders can twist faith into a weapon, turning the pulpit into a palace of manipulation and the ministry into a prison. Communities learned the hard way that a preacher's charm does not guarantee moral integrity, and that vigilance, oversight, and transparency are essential wherever power and devotion intersect. Tony Alamo destroyed not only his ministry, but countless lives. and his story remains one of the most infamous examples of a pastor whose crimes were made possible by blind trust, unchecked authority, and a facade of religious piety. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Geronimo Aguilar rose to fame in Richmond, Virginia, as the dynamic streetwise founder of the Richmond Outreach Center, widely known as the ROC. What began as a small, gritty church designed to help addicts and struggling families grew into one of the most influential megachurches in the region. Aguilar's message was simple: redemption is possible for anyone, no matter their past. For years, thousands believed him. They believed the man who preached about second chances, about moral rebirth, about walking away from sin through the power of faith. But as investigators would eventually uncover, Aguilar was not the man he claimed to be. Behind the sermons, the community outreach programs, the televised services, and the seemingly endless acts of charity lay a devastating secret, one that would tear apart not just his ministry, but the faith of countless people who had once looked to him as a spiritual savior. Aguilar, born in California, had grown up in an environment filled with instability and violence. His early years were marked by poverty, turbulent relationships, and exposure to gang culture. He often shared these details publicly from the pulpit, shaping the narrative of a broken man saved by God. People loved that authenticity. They loved his energy, his humility, and his determination to pull others out of the same darkness he claimed to have escaped. He started the Richmond Outreach Center in the 1990s, focusing heavily on street evangelism and outreach to vulnerable populations. His ministry style was raw and unpolished, but this was precisely what made him stand out. He didn't dress like a traditional pastor. He didn't use theological jargon. He didn't distance himself from people in pain. He was accessible, relatable, and electrifying. Under his leadership, the ROC exploded in size. The church purchased buses to pick up the homeless for services. They ran recovery programs, housing initiatives, prison ministries, food banks, and youth outreach. Donations poured in, volunteers multiplied, and Pastor G became something of a local celebrity. His congregation adored him, praising him as a spiritual warrior who lived on the front lines of urban ministry. But while his public persona glowed with righteousness, Aguilar harbored secrets no one could have imagined. These secrets dated back decades, long before the ROC, stretching into his early adulthood in Fort Worth, Texas. For years, allegations lingered quietly in distant court records, barely noticed by the public. These records accused Aguilar of engaging in sexual misconduct with minor girls. Acts that investigators later revealed involved manipulation, coercion, and exploitation of young victims who trusted him. Despite these allegations, Aguilar managed to move across states and continue building churches, partly because the cases were old, partly because victims struggled to come forward, and partly because Aguilar's charisma allowed him to evade scrutiny. But things changed in 2013. Two women, sisters, finally stepped forward publicly. Their accusations were clear. Aguilar had sexually abused them repeatedly when they were minors. Back when he lived in Texas and served in ministry roles, their stories were not vague. They contained details of grooming, manipulation, and the exploitation of his position as a spiritual leader. This time, the authorities listened. The Richmond community was stunned when detectives arrived at the ROC with warrants. Church members had no idea their beloved pastor had a past filled with hidden accusations. Some refused to believe it. Others felt a sudden collapse of trust, a sense that something had always felt off, but they could never explain why. As the investigation unfolded, more disturbing patterns emerged. Trips Aguilar had taken with young girls, inappropriate boundaries, evidence pointing to long-term predatory behavior. It became clear that the man who preached salvation had spent years perpetrating the very sins he condemned from the pulpit. In May 2013, Aguilar was arrested and extradited to Texas. The charges included aggravated sexual assault of a child and indecency with a minor, crimes that carried serious prison sentences. His bond was set high, and even before his trial began, the board of the ROC announced his resignation. Once the announcement made national headlines, supporters and critics alike were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. They had placed immense trust in a man who had exploited the power of faith. The trial was harrowing. Victims testified about how Aguilar used spiritual authority and emotional manipulation to commit acts that would haunt them for life. prosecutors outlined a pattern of behavior that began long before Aguilar became a megachurch leader. Behavior he never truly abandoned. In 2015, Aguilar was convicted. He received a 40-year prison sentence, effectively ending his career, tearing apart the Richmond Outreach Center, and sending shockwaves through the evangelical world. The aftermath was devastating. The ROC struggled to survive the scandal. Donations dried up, membership plummeted. The once vibrant, bustling megachurch became a symbol of betrayal. The people who had found sobriety, community, and purpose through the ministry felt abandoned, disillusioned, and humiliated. Many questioned their faith, wondering how God could allow such a man to rise to power. Former staff came forward with stories of controlling behavior, emotional intimidation, and authoritarian leadership. Some admitted they had seen red flags but feared questioning a man so revered. Others regretted defending him instinctively before the truth came out. The victims, meanwhile, faced an uphill battle toward healing. Their bravery in coming forward inspired reforms in other churches and ministries, where boards began taking allegations more seriously, implementing background checks, and adopting greater accountability measures. Pastor Geronimo Aguilar's story remains one of the most notorious examples of a charismatic Christian leader who destroyed not only his ministry, but the lives of those who trusted him most. His rise and fall reflect a painful truth about religious authority. When power goes unchecked, when charisma overshadows accountability, and when devotion blinds discernment, the most vulnerable suffer the most. In the end, Aguilar's legacy is not the thousands he led to faith, the programs he built, or the church he created. Instead, it is a lingering warning about the dangers of misplaced trust, unchecked pastoral power, and the darkness that can hide behind the brightest lights of religious leadership. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Kirbyjon Caldwell was once one of the most celebrated religious leaders in the United States, known for his financial brilliance, entrepreneurial spirit, and charismatic presence. He served as the longtime pastor of Windsor Village United Methodist Church in Houston, Texas, one of the largest Methodist congregations in the nation. Caldwell had built a reputation that extended far beyond church walls, becoming a national figure, an advisor to U.S. presidents, a pioneer of faith-based community development, and a symbol of what modern church leadership could achieve when faith met financial empowerment. But behind his public success and polished media image lay decisions that would ultimately dismantle decades of goodwill. In the end, his story stands as one of the most astonishing examples of how a respected pastor could go from pulpit to prison, guilty of orchestrating a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme that preyed on trust, credibility, and the financial innocence of his followers. Kirbyjon Caldwell was born in 1953 in Houston, and from an early age people noted his intelligence, work ethic, and leadership qualities. He attended Carleton College, then earned a master's degree at Wharton School of Business, one of the most prestigious business programs in the country. He later received a Master of Divinity from Perkins School of Theology, fusing theological training with business sophistication in ways that would define his career. When he became senior pastor of Windsor Village in 1982, the church had a modest membership. Under his leadership, it exploded into a mega-congregation of over 14,000 members. Caldwell's impact was not limited to Sunday sermons. He spearheaded massive economic revitalization efforts in Houston's underserved communities, launching housing developments, commercial centers, schools, and social service programs. He was invited to pray at presidential inaugurations and even served as an informal advisor on faith-based initiatives. For many, Caldwell represented the very best of African American religious leadership, visionary, dynamic, and unafraid to combine theology with practical action. Yet over time, the pressures of influence, the expectations of success, and the temptation to operate beyond ethical boundaries began to surface. Behind the scenes, Caldwell was becoming involved in high-risk financial ventures. One such venture would become the centerpiece of his downfall: the sale of Chinese pre-revolutionary bonds, worthless historical artifacts that held no monetary value but were marketed as rare investment opportunities. Between 2013 and 2014, Caldwell, alongside a financial partner, Gregory Smith, began soliciting wealthy church members, acquaintances, and investors for what they described as access to exclusive Chinese bonds that were supposedly valued at billions of dollars. The sales pitch leaned heavily on Caldwell's credibility as a respected pastor. Investors were told the bonds were safe, legal, and backed by international finance structures. Smith was presented as a licensed financial planner who would manage the transactions. Caldwell, the spiritual authority, assured investors that their funds were helping build a high-return portfolio. The strategy worked. People trusted him not because of the potential profit, but because of his standing as a pastor. Over the course of the scheme, Caldwell and Smith collected over $3.5 million from individuals who believed they were making legitimate investments. Many of the victims were elderly or long-time church supporters who assumed Caldwell would never lead them astray. But the bonds were worthless. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission had warned for years that these so-called Chinese pre-revolutionary bonds were often used in scams. They had no legitimate market value, no government recognition, and no possibility of future redemption. Still, Caldwell continued accepting money. Some investors were given small returns or interest payments to create the illusion of legitimacy. But these payments were not profits, they were taken from other investors. Classic Ponzi-style behavior. Most investors never received a dime back. As federal investigators would later detail, Caldwell personally pocketed hundreds of thousands of dollars, using the funds for mortgage payments, personal expenses, and debts unrelated to church ministry. By 2014, the scheme began collapsing. Investors grew nervous when promised returns did not arrive. Complaints were filed, and eventually the FBI and SEC launched investigations. Evidence mounted quickly. Emails, bank transfers, recorded calls, and testimonies from victims revealed the depth of deception. While Caldwell initially denied wrongdoing, insisting he was trying to help investors, the paper trail told a different story. In 2018, the fraud scheme was publicly unveiled when the SEC filed charges against Caldwell and Smith. The revelation sent shockwaves across Houston and the broader faith community. Many could not reconcile the charismatic pastor they knew with the man accused of orchestrating a multi-million-dollar scam. In 2020, Caldwell pleaded guilty to wire fraud conspiracy, admitting his role in the scheme. During sentencing, federal prosecutors described the case as a betrayal of extraordinary magnitude. The court noted that Caldwell had used his status as a pastor to create trust, and without his spiritual influence, the fraud would never have succeeded. Caldwell was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison, along with restitution requirements, totaling millions. His co-defendant received a longer sentence due to his direct role in targeting elderly victims. The aftermath of Caldwell's conviction sent deep emotional waves through his congregation. Many members felt blindsided, heartbroken, and spiritually shaken. For decades they had built ministries alongside him, believed in his mission, and trusted him as a moral leader. Some supporters defended him publicly, insisting he had simply made financial mistakes. But for victims, many of whom had invested retirement savings, college funds, or inheritance money, the damage was irreversible. The fall of Kirbyjon Caldwell became a stark case study in how spiritual authority can be manipulated to facilitate financial crimes. Experts analyzing the case pointed out that Caldwell's charm, reputation, and community achievements created a psychological safety net that made investors feel protected. The line between pastor and financier blurred, and trust replaced diligencer. Dangerous dynamic when money is involved. Even from prison, Caldwell attempted to maintain a narrative of misunderstanding rather than malicious intent. But the financial consequences, legal admissions, and forensic accounting told a story that left little room for reinterpretation. His ministry was effectively dismantled, his public reputation destroyed, and his legacy forever overshadowed by the scandal. Today, Caldwell remains an example, frequently cited in discussions about ethics in religious leadership, financial transparency, and the vulnerabilities of congregations who place total trust in charismatic figures. His story reveals the complexity of pastoral authority, how it can inspire communities to build, grow, and thrive, yet also how easily it can be twisted into a weapon of exploitation. In the end, Caldwell's journey from nationally respected pastor to convicted felon stands as a reminder that no amount of influence, intelligence, or spiritual language can justify deception. When a shepherd uses the trust of believers to enrich himself, the results can be devastating, not just financially, but emotionally and spiritually. His fall from power underscores a truth echoed across many of the cases in this series. When a pastor crosses the line between spiritual guidance and personal greed, the damage reaches far beyond bank accounts. It undermines faith itself. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Mark Driscoll became one of the most recognizable, controversial, and influential evangelical leaders in the United States during the early 2000s. As the founder of Mars Hill Church in Seattle, Driscoll cultivated a reputation for being bold, uncompromising, and willing to challenge modern culture with a forceful, masculine brand of Christianity that resonated with tens of thousands of followers. At the peak of his success, Mars Hill Church grew into a multi-campus megachurch with over 15,000 weekly attendees, millions of sermon downloads, national conferences, and widespread influence across evangelical culture. But beneath the surface of rapid expansion, best-selling books, and charismatic preaching, a pattern of bullying, spiritual abuse, financial misconduct, and authoritarian leadership was slowly pulling the ministry apart. Driscoll's story began in the mid-1990s, when he launched Mars Hill with only a handful of members. His raw, direct preaching style instantly set him apart. He spoke candidly about sexuality, culture, sin, and male responsibility at a time when many pastors were adopting softer, more approachable tones. Younger audiences embraced his message. He felt real, unfiltered, and fearless. Rapid growth followed. Driscoll positioned himself as a leader of the new Calvinist movement, becoming a founding member of the Gospel Coalition and regularly appearing at evangelical conferences and events. By the early 2000s, Mars Hill had become one of the fastest-growing churches in the nation. Driscoll's sermons were downloaded millions of times per year. His message that men should take control of their families, households, and spiritual lives resonated, even as critics argued that his rhetoric frequently veered into misogyny, authoritarianism, and emotional intimidation. But behind the explosive growth, internal concerns were mounting. Staff members described Driscoll as intimidating, volatile, and vindictive. Former elders and pastors said he created a culture where disagreement was viewed as rebellion, and loyalty to Driscoll personally was more important than commitment to the congregation. Several longtime leaders resigned, citing emotional abuse, threats, or being forced out for raising concerns. These internal fractures remained hidden from the public for years, until former staff members began speaking out. One of the earliest major controversies emerged in 2007, when former elders accused Driscoll of creating a toxic leadership culture. Church members were disciplined or shunned for questioning decisions, and staff recalled meetings described as verbal beat. Concerns were raised to outside evangelical organizations, but Driscoll's rising popularity often overshadowed his critics. Then came a series of scandals that ultimately led to Driscoll's downfall. In 2012, reports surfaced that Mars Hill had paid a marketing firm over $200,000 to artificially boost Driscoll's book, Real Marriage, onto the New York Times bestseller list, a scheme that allowed him to promote himself as a best-selling author while using church funds to do it. Critics called the tactic unethical, deceptive, and a misuse of donor contributions. Shortly after, former members published accounts of coercive church discipline processes, where individuals who attempted to leave the church were publicly humiliated, pressured into confessions, or ostracized. Dozens of staff and volunteers also came forward describing emotional abuse, harsh treatment, and a culture of fear. Some members reported that they felt more like employees of a corporation than congregants in a faith community. In 2014, the situation escalated dramatically when a group of former elders formally accused Driscoll of bullying, intimidation, and creating a fear-driven environment. They provided documentation of harsh leadership methods, including confidential recordings, emails, and testimonies from staff. The church launched an internal investigation, and the findings were damning. The report concluded that Driscoll had indeed abused his power, shown anger issues, and repeatedly humiliated staff and leaders. As the investigation continued, Driscoll went on leave, and Mars Hill Church began to collapse. Over the next several months, attendance plummeted, major campuses closed, and financial instability grew. Supporters who had once viewed him as a heroic, uncompromising pastor now saw a leader whose unchecked authority had fractured one of the largest and most influential churches in the country. In October 2014, Driscoll resigned from Mars Hill. Within weeks, the entire church organization announced that it would dissolve, closing all campuses and distributing assets to local successors. What followed was a remarkable fall. Driscoll had gone from one of the most downloaded preachers in America to a controversial figure whose leadership had become synonymous with spiritual abuse, toxic church culture, and the dangers of authoritarian leadership within religious institutions. Many former members reported long-lasting trauma, describing years of therapy needed to recover from the emotional manipulation and fear-based environment. Staff members reported burnout, depression, and shattered trust in spiritual authority. Financially, the collapse cost millions. Mars Hill had collected enormous sums in donations, tithes, and special offerings, but the organization's aggressive expansion left it unstable, and the scandal accelerated its downfall. The misuse of church funds for marketing. Driscoll's books also became a symbol of the blurred line between ministry and personal ambition. In the years after his resignation, Driscoll relocated to Arizona and launched a new church, the Trinity Church, attempting a comeback. But new controversies followed him there too. Former members of the new congregation reported similar behavior patterns, including intimidation, nepotism, and coercive control. Some families claimed they were pressured to cut ties with relatives deemed spiritually threatening. Staff eventually resigned, citing the same complaints that had ended Mars Hill. Pastor Mark Driscoll's story remains one of the most significant leadership failures in modern American Christianity. It highlights how charisma, media presence, and rapid growth can mask deeper issues within a church's leadership structure. It also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unregulated authority, the seduction of fame, and the ease with which spiritual power can be abused. Driscoll never faced prison time, but he did face widespread condemnation, investigation, and the total collapse of the ministry he built from the ground up. For many followers, the emotional and spiritual fallout was equivalent to betrayal. They lost not just a pastor, but a community, friendships, marriages, and in some cases, their faith. The downfall of Mars Hill sparked nationwide discussions about church governance, accountability, elder oversight, and mental health protection for numerous books, documentaries, and podcasts have since examined the case, including The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, which brought together testimonies from staff, victims, experts, and observers. Ultimately, Driscoll's journey from celebrated preacher to disgraced leader illustrates a painful truth. A ministry built on fear, control, and unchecked charisma may grow fast, but it cannot last. And when it collapses, the damage spreads far beyond the pulpit, into homes, families, hearts, and communities that once believed they were safe within its walls. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Samuel Lorenzana was once considered the heart of a small but rapidly growing church community in San Bernardino County, California. For years, he preached compassion, redemption, and the transformative power of faith. His sermons were emotional, filled with personal anecdotes about his own struggles and victories, and he positioned himself as a man who understood pain and could guide others through it. The congregation, many of them working-class families and young adults, saw him as a spiritual father, someone who truly cared. But behind the scenes, Lorenzana was building a dual life, one that would ultimately lead to his arrest, imprisonment, and the total destruction of the ministry he spent a decade constructing. Lorenzana founded Centro Cristiano Dios de Pactos in a rented storefront, holding weekly services that quickly began attracting attention. His charisma was magnetic. He had a way of turning simple ideas into profound spiritual lessons, often telling stories of how God had rescued him from the edge of destruction. He talked about addiction, broken relationships, and the dark paths he had once walked, though later investigations revealed many of these stories were exaggerated or entirely fabricated. But his audience didn't know that then. They saw a man who appeared honest, vulnerable, and deeply committed to God. In their eyes, he was exactly the kind of pastor you could trust. Over the next few years, the church expanded. Donations increased as Lorenzana began emphasizing the importance of sowing into God's vision. He pushed the idea that giving financially to the church was an act of obedience and a path to blessings. Under his direction, the church moved into a larger building and began live streaming services. A youth program was established, as well as a women's ministry and weekly Bible studies. Everything looked like success, but the image he portrayed publicly was a carefully constructed mask designed to hide something far darker. The first signs of trouble were small and easy to ignore. Staff noticed Lorenzana frequently changed the church's financial administrator, often claiming they were not aligned with the mission. He insisted on handling certain donations himself, particularly cash offerings. At the same time, he began taking special interest in several female congregants, most of them young, some of them vulnerable, and many of them seeking counseling. Lorenza insisted his counseling sessions be private, using what he called spiritual restoration therapy, a term he had invented to justify prolonged one-on-one meetings behind closed doors. Within the church, concerns began to grow. One of the youth leaders reported that Lorenza exhibited controlling behavior and often used prayer as a way to manipulate emotions during counseling sessions. He frequently insisted that God had given him discernment about certain people's lives, which he used to draw them closer to him personally. Those who questioned his methods were subtly pushed aside, removed from leadership roles, publicly criticized during sermons, or labeled as spiritually rebellious. The congregation trusted him so deeply that anyone who challenged him risked being ostracized. In 2019, everything began to unravel when a mother from the congregation contacted police after her 17-year-old daughter disclosed inappropriate interactions with Lorenzana. The teen revealed that the pastor had messaged her privately, claiming God had shown him visions of her future and that she needed special guidance from him. These conversations escalated into explicit messages under the guise of spiritual cleansing and emotional intimacy. Shocked and horrified, the mother gathered evidence and went to law enforcement. When detectives began investigating, they discovered the teen was not the only victim. Several women, some as young as 15, came forward with similar stories. Each described Lorenzana as charismatic, persuasive, and manipulative. He used prayer as a method to break down emotional barriers, then positioned himself as the only person who could help them heal spiritually. The investigation revealed explicit messages, inappropriate photos, and attempts by Lorenzana to isolate the victims from their families and friends. The police executed a search warrant at the church and Lorenzana's home, uncovering additional digital evidence that showed he had been contacting multiple young congregants over several years. The findings were disturbing and comprehensive, documenting a pattern of grooming, manipulation, and predatory behavior. Lorenzana was arrested in 2020, sending shockwaves through the congregation. News reports described the pastor as a respected leader who had used his authority to prey upon vulnerable young women. The church community collapsed almost immediately. Congregants who had once defended him now struggled with anger, guilt, and confusion. Many felt betrayed at the deepest spiritual level. The youth program shut down. Families left in waves, ashamed of having trusted him. The church building was eventually sold after attendance dwindled to almost nothing. During the trial, prosecutors presented messages, photos, and testimony showing a clear pattern of abuse. Lorenzana's defense attempted to frame the interactions as consensual or misinterpreted, but the evidence was overwhelming. Victims described how he manipulated their faith, telling them they were chosen by God for a special spiritual connection. He blurred the line between pastoral authority and emotional intimacy, creating dependency that made it difficult for victims to speak out. In court, the atmosphere was heavy. Former congregants filled the gallery, many of them crying silently as they listened. They heard testimony from the young women who had looked up to Lorenzana as a mentor, only to be taken advantage of. They heard about how he used scripture to justify his behavior, twisting religious teachings into tools of manipulation. They learned that he had systematically concealed evidence, deleted messages, and used his position to silence concerns. The pastor they had once worshipped had turned into someone they could hardly recognize. Lorenzana was ultimately convicted of multiple charges related to sexual misconduct with minors, exploitation, and unlawful contact with congregants. He was sentenced to 22 years in state prison, with strict requirements for psychological treatment and lifetime restrictions on contact with minors. The judge, in her final remarks, said Lorenzana had weaponized faith, causing long-term emotional and psychological damage that would affect victims for years. Following the conviction, the community struggled to understand how such betrayal had gone unnoticed. Families questioned their own judgment, wondering how they had failed to see the signs. Former church leaders expressed regret for not speaking out sooner. Some congregants abandoned religion entirely, unable to reconcile their belief in God with the pastor who had represented him. Others sought therapy, healing, and spiritual guidance from new leaders who understood the depth of the trauma. The victims, many of them now in their 20s, described ongoing struggles with trust, relationships, and faith. Some said that Lorenzana's manipulation had left them with an aversion to church environments. Others channeled their pain into advocacy, speaking publicly about the need for accountability in religious institutions. Lorenzana's story became a warning for Christian communities across California. Churches began implementing stricter policies, background checks, mandatory reporting structures, open-door counseling rules, and accountability committees. Pastors were required to undergo ethics training. Congregations learned to ask questions rather than blindly trust authority. The scandal highlighted the danger of charismatic leadership without oversight, reminding communities that faith should never overshadow basic safeguards. Inside prison, Lorenzana attempted to continue writing religious materials, but his reputation was permanently destroyed. Former supporters rejected him. His family, also devastated by his actions, distanced themselves. He lived out his sentence in obscurity, far from the pulpit, the lights, and the power he once wielded. The collapse of his ministry serves as a powerful reminder. When a pastor loses integrity, the fallout can devastate entire communities. Lives are changed forever. Faith is shaken. Trust is shattered. Pastor Samuel Lorenzana's legacy is not one of healing, growth, or salvation. It is of betrayal, manipulation, and the complete destruction of a ministry that once claimed to serve God. His story stands as a sobering example of how easily spiritual authority can be twisted into a weapon, and how dark the path can become when a leader chooses sin over righteousness. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Samuel B. Wright of Wilson County, North Carolina, was once regarded as a man molded by Scripture and driven by a calling he claimed came directly from God. Born in 1969 and raised in a small rural community, Wright grew up in a strict Christian household, attending Sunday services without fail and participating in youth groups, choir sessions, and Bible camps. His parents, devout believers, often told neighbors how Samuel had the spirit of a preacher in him, even as a young boy. By his early 20s, Wright seemed destined for ministry. He enrolled in a modest Bible college, completed pastoral training, and soon found himself preaching at small churches across eastern North Carolina. His sermons were passionate. He spoke of salvation, repentance, obedience, and spiritual discipline, captivating congregants with a preaching style that felt more like emotional storytelling than theological lectures. People were drawn to his conviction. Older church members said that when Samuel preached, it felt like listening to someone who understood both Scripture and suffering. Younger congregants found him charismatic and approachable, often describing him as the pastor who actually listens. His rise was rapid, and by his mid-30s he was chosen to lead New Light Christian Ministries, a growing congregation with nearly 300 members at its peak. Wright embraced the position with enthusiasm. He generated momentum by launching youth outreach programs, marriage counseling workshops, and financial guidance seminars. He started recording sermons, uploading them online, and promoting himself as a voice for spiritual renewal in rural America. Donations increased. Attendance grew. Wright became a recognizable face in Wilson County, not just a pastor, but a community figure who visited hospitals, officiated weddings, mentored troubled youth, and partnered with neighboring churches to organize charity drives. But behind the scenes, cracks were forming in his carefully curated image. Wright's personal finances were strained, partly due to poor spending habits, and partly because he had grown accustomed to a lifestyle he could not afford on a pastor's salary. Credit card debts piled up, car payments fell behind, his marriage was strained. Instead of addressing these challenges responsibly, Wright began to explore ways to manipulate church funds, rationalizing his actions under the guise of pastoral privilege and temporary borrowing. At first, the thefts were small petty cash withdrawals and misuse of church debit cards that could be explained away as ministry expenses. But as the pressure mounted, the amounts grew. Wright discovered that the church's accounting system was outdated and relied primarily on trust. The treasurer was elderly, trusting, and deeply loyal. Financial reports were reviewed only twice per year. There were no external audits, no checks and balances, and no oversight committee demanding transparency. For a man desperate and increasingly emboldened, this was an open door. Wright began siphoning money from the building fund, designated tithes, and charitable donations. When congregants placed envelopes marked for mission work, he sometimes opened them privately and pocketed portions of the cash. Over time, he gained access to the church's bank account, and once he realized he could move funds without immediate detection, the theft escalated from hundreds to thousands. By 2016, Wright's financial misconduct had spiraled into a full-scale embezzlement operation. He forged signatures, fabricated invoices, and submitted fake receipts to justify withdrawals. He paid personal bills using church funds. He financed home renovations, purchased electronics, and booked hotel stays under the guise of ministry travel. His actions were deliberate, calculated, and continuous, not impulsive mistakes, but a pattern of deception built on opportunity and lack of oversight. The congregation began noticing signs of distress within the ministry. Projects that had been promised new playground equipment, updated sound systems, a parking lot resurfacing, never materialized despite thousands of dollars being raised for each initiative. The church's benevolence fund dwindled inexplicably. Checks bounced, vendors complained about unpaid invoices, rumors circulated among deacons, choir members, and longtime donors. Still, Wright maintained an aura of spiritual authority, assuring congregants that accounting delays and unexpected expenses were to blame. But in 2017, a new treasurer, younger, detail-oriented member with a background in business took over the books. Within weeks, she identified discrepancies. Financial records didn't align. Bank statements revealed unusual withdrawals. Receipts didn't match expenditures. When she attempted to reconcile the accounts, she found multiple false entries and missing documentation. Recognizing the severity of the situation, she quietly informed the church's board. The board was hesitant. Wright had been their pastor for more than a decade. He had baptized their children, married their relatives, buried their loved ones. Many members didn't want to believe the allegations, fearing that confronting Wright would fracture the congregation. But the treasurer insisted on a full review. Over the next several weeks, board members assembled receipts, compared financial statements, and examined electronic transactions. The evidence was overwhelming. Tens of thousands of dollars were unaccounted for. The board confronted Wright in a tense, private meeting. At first, he denied the accusations, calling them attacks from the enemy and insisting that he had only used funds to support ministry efforts. When pressed, he became emotional, shifting between anger, tears, and spiritual language meant to guilt and manipulate the board. But the documents spoke louder than his words. After hours of questioning, Wright's denials collapsed, though he never fully admitted the extent of his actions. The board wrestled with what to do next. Some argued that matters should be handled internally to protect the congregation from scandal. Others insisted that crimes of this magnitude required legal action. Ultimately, they chose accountability. They reported Wright to local authorities, triggering a criminal investigation led by Wilson County detectives. Officers executed subpoenas, collected bank records, and interviewed church staff. Wright's financial trail unraveled quickly. In 2018, after months of investigation, Wright was arrested and charged with embezzlement, obtaining property by false pretenses, and financial fraud. The news stunned the community. Local headlines described the once beloved pastor now facing prison time. Congregants were heartbroken, angry, and bewildered. Some refused to believe the charges, insisting that Wright had been framed. Others felt shame and betrayal, questioning how they had been deceived for so long. During the trial, prosecutors presented a detailed account of Wright's misconduct. They outlined how he stole more than $100,000 from church funds over several years. They introduced forged documents, bank statements, and testimonies from financial experts. Former church members described Wright's charismatic influence, his ability to manipulate emotions, and the trust he exploited. The defense attempted to portray Wright as a man overwhelmed by stress, financial hardship, and mental health struggles. They argued that he had intended to repay the funds and had acted out of desperation. But the evidence years of systematic theft and deception undermined any claims of temporary lapses in judgment. In the end, the judge condemned Wright's actions as a violation of sacred trust, emphasizing that his role as pastor made the betrayal even more egregious. Wright was sentenced to multiple years in state prison, ordered to pay restitution, and permanently barred from serving in any fiduciary capacity within a religious organization. The aftermath for the congregation was painful. New Light Christian Ministries lost members, financial stability, and community credibility. Longtime donors withdrew support. The church had to close several outreach programs due to lack of funds. Volunteers stepped in to stabilize the ministry, but the emotional wounds lingered. Many congregants expressed anger not only at Wright, but at themselves for having believed so strongly in him. For the victims, those who had tithed faithfully, donated to building funds, or contributed to missions, the betrayal felt personal. Some experienced spiritual crises, stepping away from church entirely. Others found themselves wrestling with guilt, shame, or distrust toward clergy. The emotional and psychological impact extended far beyond financial loss. Yet, in the aftermath, the church made efforts to rebuild trust. They implemented new financial safeguards, required regular audits, and established leadership committees to ensure transparency. Counselors and pastors from nearby congregations offered support to members struggling with grief and disillusionment. Slowly, the community began to heal, though Wright's shadow remained part of their story. Pastor Samuel B. Wright's fall from grace serves as a stark reminder that authority without accountability can become a breeding ground for corruption. His story is a cautionary tale about how spiritual leaders, when unchecked, can exploit devotion, manipulate belief, and destroy the very ministries they were called to nurture. It also raises haunting questions. How does someone entrusted with guiding souls toward righteousness become the architect of deception? How can a congregation protect itself from leaders who abuse trust behind closed doors? And how many other stories like Wright's remain hidden, concealed by charisma, scripture, and the cloak of spiritual legitimacy?